All right, so um, you've really given us quite a bit here with these audio lectures in this chapter called Natural Kinds and Theoretical Concepts. Uh, it seems like we're going to really be digging into this whole question of how much of what we feel is universal, hardwired, versus like what our culture kind of shapes in us. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a fascinating question, no doubt. I mean, we talk about love, fear, anger, all these things, as if everyone experiences them in exactly the same way. But when you start looking a little closer, things get a little messier.
Well, that's what makes it a deep dive, right? I mean, one of the audio lectures mentions this tribe where kids are taught to fear elders, like the older people
Right.
and neighboring tribes,
Mm.
which isn't exactly like a bear chasing you through the woods.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. It definitely challenges that assumption that fear is always about, some tangible, immediate danger, like the bear chasing you, right? Maybe what we call fear is more like a template, I guess. And each culture kind of fills in the specifics. Some people argue though that if the causes are so different, then the emotions themselves must be fundamentally different too.
Hmm. I don't know about that. Couldn't you have like different things causing the same, core emotion, like my fear of public speaking
Mm.
and someone else's fear of spiders? I mean, they feel different, obviously, but there's still some shared fearfulness going on somewhere in there, right?
You've hit on a key point. A lot of theorists say that emotions have these, what they call essences. It's not just what triggers them,
Hmm.
but there are consistent patterns underneath. Like it could be certain behaviors,
Hmm.
the way our brains react, even specific beliefs tied to, that particular feeling.
So, like, if across cultures, people who are experiencing fear all make, similar facial expressions or has similar hormonal spikes, even if they're afraid in different things, that'd be evidence for like a universal essence of fear.
Exactly. But this is where Armit Jones, he's the one featured in the audio lectures, kind of throws a wrench in things. He's really skeptical that emotions are anything more than, well, just the cause and our reaction to that cause, like input and output, no deeper meaning.
I don't know. That just feels kind of simplistic, doesn't it? Like, if you said that a painting is just brushstrokes on a canvas, ignoring the artist's intention, the historical context, all that. I mean, sure, those things exist, but the painting is more than just that, right?
A lot of people would agree with you there. And this is where the concept of innate gets pretty tricky. The audio mentions that some folks think like innate emotional responses are pretty insignificant compared to all these complex reactions that we learn from our culture. So like, yeah, sure, babies cry, but how we express sadness as adults, that's a whole different ballgame.
So are they saying we're just blank slates when it comes to feelings? Like everything is just social programming?
Not necessarily. They do acknowledge there's some innate basis, but they really emphasize how much culture molds that, base. The problem is innate is often seen as fixed. Like you're born with it and that's it, end of story. But even evolved traits are influenced by the environment, right? Take language, for example. Our brains are wired for it, but which language we speak totally depends on where we grow up.
Okay, so emotions might be kind of like that too. We have this like predisposition, but the specific language of our feelings is learned.
That's a great way to put it. The thing is, though, if these constructionists, the ones who focus on cultural influence, they focus too much on how each culture is unique, they almost make categorizing emotions pointless.
Yeah, right. Because if every instance of joy is totally different depending on the culture, then how do we even study it? It all just becomes chaos.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which begs the question, if we can categorize emotions across cultures, how do we account for those differences that we definitely see, right? Because love in, say, 12th century Japan is obviously not identical to love in, modern America.
It's not even just history, right? Like even within a culture, teenage love has its own thing going on. Is that real love or just like some warped version of it?
And this is where the idea of these cultural models is helpful. Think of them like templates passed down, through generations. Even if teenage love feels unique and special, you can still trace it back to, say, medieval ideas of courtly love, chivalry, all that stuff. So it's evolved for sure, but it's built on something.
So it's like a meme, but for feelings. Like each generation put its own little spin on it, but there's this core idea that's being replicated.
Exactly. This helps explain why cultures even develop these particular emotional flavors. Like, what purpose does this kind of love serve for teenagers? For their society? It becomes less about just, an individual's feelings and more about this social function.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff. But the audio also brings up inappropriate emotions. And it seems like even Armit Jones, who leans towards everything being learned, he kind of admits that there must be some shared categories. Because, well, how else could we judge an emotion as, like, wrong for the situation?
Right. If each culture's emotions were truly unique and, untranslatable, how could we even recognize that inappropriateness? It kind of points to a flaw in extreme holism. That idea that every aspect of a culture is only understandable within that specific culture.
So maybe the question isn't, are emotions universal or are culturally shaped? But rather, how much high of each is at play? Which brings us to that book chapter. And this whole natural kinds idea, I got to admit, that one's kind of over my head.
Yeah, it sounds intimidating. But it's basically about categories in the world that have a deeper reason for existing, that makes them useful for understanding things. Think about the periodic table. Each element is unique, right? But they're grouped based on their underlying properties.
Okay, I kind of get that. But how do feelings fit into this?
Hmm.
Is there like a periodic table of emotions out there somewhere?
Well, not quite that neat and tidy. But the chapter introduces this concept called causal homeostasis. It's Boyd's concept. And it basically means that the shared features of a category aren't just random. They cluster together because of a deeper reason. And that reason is, well, why that category even matters in the first place.
So it's not just about what we see on the surface,
Yeah.
right? Like someone crying, yelling, whatever. But it's about those hidden mechanics that make them cry or yell in a consistent way.
Exactly. Think about how kids learn what an uncle is,
All
right?
right.
At first, it's just superficial, friendly guy, gives presents. But they eventually understand that it's about a specific family relationship. It's a structure that exists even if the guy is, like, grumpy and never gives any gifts.
All right, I'm starting to see the parallel here. So to really get emotions, we need to go beyond just, what they feel like, what triggers them. We got to dig into the deeper stuff, right? Whether it's biology, cultural patterns, both. There's got to be something that makes, like, anger, consistently anger across all these different variations.
That's the core of it. And teasing out that something is what makes this whole exploration so fascinating.
Well, consider me teased. I'm ready to get into some specifics. How about we start with one emotion and really try to unpack it using these ideas?
I like that. Sounds like a plan. Which emotion are you thinking?
Let's see. Well, given all this talk about inappropriate feelings, maybe fear would be a good one to start with.
Ooh, good choice. Fear is interesting. I mean, it feels so primal. But we've also built all these layers of cultural baggage on top of it. Should be fun to unpack that one.
Right. Fear it is. Let's dive in. So fear, right? I mean, it's something we all know, right? That like gut-wrenching feeling. You want to run or maybe freeze up. But is what's going on like inside us, is that the same across cultures?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. And this is where looking for that, causal homeostasis, those underlying mechanisms, it gets really interesting because on the surface, fear seems like it's all over the place, right? I mean, each culture is afraid of different things. Some people are scared of heights, others, spiders. It's all different.
So how can there even be a unifying fear thing if what we're afraid of is so diverse? It'd be like saying, food is a natural kind when like what people consider edible is totally different all around the world.
That's a great point. But remember, it's not just about what triggers the feeling. It's about like what happens next. Think about the fight or flight response. Your heart's racing, sweating, you get tunnel vision. That's remarkably consistent. I mean, even across different species.
Oh, right. Like that feeling when you almost step on a snake.
Right.
Doesn't even matter if it's actually venomous or not. Your body just like freaks out the same way, at least at first.
Exactly. That physiological cascade, that's a key part of what we call fear. So the trigger, that's culturally learned. But the underlying machinery, that could be universal. It's like our bodies all have this emergency alarm system.
Right.
And each culture just sets it off with different, stimuli.
Okay. I like that. That makes sense. But it makes me wonder, what about like emotions that are less about immediate survival and more about like social stuff, like love, for example? I mean, can you really have a fight or flight response to like someone breaking up with you?
Well, you bring up a good point. Love, trickier.
Yeah.
But it's still fascinating. If you look at it through this lens, we know there are biological systems for, attachment. Like there are bonding hormones, oxytocin, which has been called, the love hormone.
Oh, so there's like a chemical basis for it then. Maybe that explains why those feelings are so intense, the obsession. It's almost like you're high on love sometimes.
In a way, yeah. But those chemicals, they don't dictate how love is actually, expressed or even experienced, really. And that's where those cultural models we were talking about, they come in. Think about it, arranged marriages
Right.
versus, love at first sight cultures, biologically, similar things might be happening. But the whole narrative around it, that's totally different.
So it's like our biology gives us the building blocks, right? But our culture provides the instruction manual for how to actually build the relationship.
Exactly. And those instruction manuals, they can change drastically over time, too. Remember how we were talking about teenage love? Well, in the West, you can trace that back to, like, medieval courtly love,
Ah,
all that stuff about idealized romance, these unattainable ladies, and poems from afar.
wow. Yeah, that's a far cry from, Tinder and hookup culture. But you're saying that even those, which seem like totally opposite things, are still built on the same, emotional foundation.
That's the idea. It's like cultural evolution, right? The core emotion, that might stay recognizable, but how it's expressed, what triggers it, even what it means, that can all change over time.
Okay, so we've got fear, which is like this emergency response system, and love, which is like this attachment system, but it's shaped by culture. What about something like sadness? Is that purely biological, like a grief response? Or is there a cultural element there too?
Sadness is interesting because it really highlights this performance aspect of emotions. We know that, there are biological processes for loss, but how we express that, that's heavily influenced by what our culture thinks is appropriate. Think about, mourning rituals. Some cultures have wailing, public displays, other it's all about quiet introspection.
Oh, right. Like in some cultures, it's actually rude to not cry really loudly at a funeral. And in others, keeping a stiff upper lip, that's seen as strength. So even experiencing grief correctly is something we learn from our culture.
Exactly. And this kind of brings us back to inappropriate emotions. What if some of those judgments aren't about the emotion itself being wrong, but about it being performed in a way that, like, clashes with the culture's script for that emotion?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. So if someone is really stoic, in a culture where big emotional displays are expected, we might think they're heartless, when really they're just, sad in their own way. It really makes you rethink those snap judgments we make, huh?
It does, and it brings us to a point that you raised earlier. If each culture's emotions are so radically different, how do we even study them? And this is where even strong constructionists, they kind of have to agree that there must be at least some shared categories, or everything just dissolves into, relativism.
Okay, I'm following you. But if we're going beyond, you know, just surface level feelings and into biology, then what about disgust? I mean, that feels super primal, right? Like, get this out of my mouth kind of reaction. Surely that's universal.
Disgust is interesting because it's often considered, one of those basic emotions, like it's hardwired into us. But even there, culture plays a role. I mean, what we find disgusting, it can be so diverse. Think about food taboos. Some cultures eat insects. Other cultures, they're like totally repulsed by that.
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely in a repulse camp on that one.
Yeah.
But you're saying that even that, ew reaction, which feels so instinctual, it could still be learned.
Well, to some extent, yeah, it's like that alarm system. Again,
Right.
the capacity for disgust, that might be built in. But what actually sets it off, that's shaped by cultural norms, like what's considered clean or polluting in that society.
This is making me think about how we were talking about those essences of emotions earlier.
Mhm.
Would it even be possible to find a specific brain region that, lights up when someone feels disgust,
Mhm.
regardless of what it is that's disgusting them?
That's exactly what researchers are trying to figure out. If
Yeah.
they could find, like a disgust center and it was consistent across cultures, that would be really strong evidence,
Yeah.
for this biological basis, even in something that seems as culturally influenced as disgust.
Wow. So even those gut reactions could have a physical location in our brains.
Yeah.
That's wild. But okay, so far we've been talking about individual emotions, right? Fear, love, sadness, disgust. But but are we any closer to actually answering the big question here? What are emotions fundamentally?
We're getting there. It's
Yeah.
it's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, right? We've got the
Huh.
biological level with the hormones, brain activity, all those innate systems. And
Got
then we've
that.
got the cultural level, with the models, the scripts, the rules about how to express and interpret those feelings.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And it's the interplay between those levels that creates the unique emotional experience for each person, right, within their culture. Like my fear isn't identical to yours, but there's enough overlap that we can still call it fear, and
Right.
we can understand each other.
Exactly. And this highlights a really crucial point. Emotions aren't static things. They change, over time, both personally and culturally. What scared me as a kid might not scare me now. And what was considered an acceptable way to express anger in the past, that might be taboo today.
So we're talking about emotions as like processes, not like fixed categories, almost like it's a verb, not a noun.
I like that. And this is kind of where language itself becomes a limitation. Like the word love, it can mean so many things, from like romantic passion to familial bonds. But we kind of lump it all together under that one word. Maybe we need a richer vocabulary to capture all those nuances.
That's so true. I mean, saying I love pizza and I love my partner are clearly not the same type of feeling, but we use the same word for both.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what other emotional experiences we might be missing out on just because, we don't have the words to express them.
That's an excellent point, and it's why simply defining emotions isn't enough. We have to really delve into those underlying mechanisms, the biology, the cultural evolution. That's how we'll really grasp what's going on. And remember, even our understanding of those mechanisms, that's constantly evolving too, as science progresses.
Okay, so it's complex, it's dynamic, and we're still figuring it out. Sounds about right for, anything to do with humans, I guess. But this brings up another question for me. If emotions are so shaped by culture, what about cultures that, we haven't even encountered yet?
What do you mean?
Well, we've been focusing on, existing cultures, right? Historical and present. But what about the future? Could there be entirely new emotions that arise, like as technology changes, social structures shift, or even, what if we encounter alien life with completely different ways of feeling?
Now that is a fascinating question. It really pushes us to think beyond just, categorizing what we already know and towards imagining, the potential for completely novel emotional experiences.
Yeah. It's like we've been talking about the periodic table of emotions, but what if there are like elements that we haven't even discovered yet, whole new columns, with properties we can't even fathom?
That's a great analogy. And it brings us to another complex emotion that's often, at the center of both personal and societal struggles. Anger, an emotion that seems, well, both deeply primal and yet incredibly susceptible to cultural shaping.
Anger, huh? Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, it definitely feels like it has that biological, fight response tied into it.
Yeah.
But how we express it, what makes us angry, that's all over the map, ready to tackle that beast.
Absolutely. Anger is a prime example of how those deeper mechanisms that we've been discussing can manifest, in ways that really shape our lives and even our societies.
Okay, anger. It's definitely one of those emotions that can like totally hijack your whole system, But is it the same anger in every culture, or is it just a convenient label we slap on a whole bunch of different things?
It's a great question, and it really makes us think about, how much of an emotion is like hardwired versus, learned from our environment. On the one hand, you've got that primal fight response, like we were talking about earlier, the adrenaline surge, the urge to like lash out, that feeling of heat rising,
Wow. Oh, yeah. I know that feeling. Road rage, anyone. But I'm guessing you're going to tell me that even though that like physical response might be universal, what actually sets it off, what triggers it, that's culturally specific, right?
Exactly. I mean, think about it. In some cultures, anger is seen as a sign of strength, something to be embraced. But in others, it's like shameful, something to suppress at all costs. And those cultural norms, they shape everything, from what's considered an appropriate target for that anger to how it's expressed.
So like in some cultures, it's okay to yell at your boss, while in others, even frowning at someone in authority is a huge no-no. Man, that could lead to some awkward cross-cultural encounters.
Absolutely. And it shows how, our judgments about what's appropriate when it comes to emotional responses, they're often more about cultural expectations than like some objective standard. What's seen as a healthy assertion of boundaries in one culture that might be seen as, disrespect or even aggression in another.
Wow, yeah. It makes you wonder if a lot of the conflict we see, both personal and like on a global scale, it comes from misinterpreting each other's anger.
Yeah.
Based on, our own cultural biases.
Yeah, it's a very real possibility, and it really underscores, how important it is to understand these cultural nuances, especially now, in our increasingly interconnected world. If we can learn to recognize that anger might be expressed differently, depending on someone's background, it could lead to, well, more empathy and less conflict.
Okay, so anger has this biological fight component, but it's played out on this cultural stage with all these different, props and scripts. But how does this fit into that whole natural kinds discussion? Can something even be a natural kind if it's so, malleable, if it can change so much?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Remember, for something to be a natural kind, there needs to be a deeper reason, a causal homeostasis for why those shared features, why they cluster together. So with anger, it's not just about whether it looks the same across cultures, right? It's about whether there's a common, like, underlying mechanism driving it.
So even if the outward expression of anger is different, there might still be a universal anger signature hidden somewhere in our brains.
That's exactly the hypothesis that some researchers are exploring. They're looking for, like, specific neural pathways or brain regions that consistently activate when someone experiences anger,
Yeah.
regardless of, what triggered it or how they're expressing it.
So if they find that, everyone's amygdala lights up when they're mad, whether they're shouting or just silently fuming, that would support this idea of anger as a natural kind.
Exactly. It would suggest that there's a biological core to anger, a shared foundation upon which culture then builds its variations. And this has huge implications, not just for understanding anger, but for potentially treating, anger-related issues.
That's amazing. So if there's this biological anger circuit in our brains, could we develop therapies or interventions that target that circuit directly,
Yeah.
regardless of the person's cultural background?
It's definitely a possibility that researchers are, looking into. Imagine being able to help people manage their anger, not just by changing their thoughts,
Yeah.
or behaviors, but by actually modulating the underlying, neural activity.
That would be incredible. But of course, this is all theoretical, right? I mean, there's a lot more research that needs to be done
Yeah.
before we can start rewiring people's anger response.
Oh, absolutely. But the fact that we're even asking these questions, it shows how far we've come in understanding this complex interplay between biology and culture in shaping our emotions.
This whole deep dive has been mind-blowing, honestly. I feel like I've gone from thinking of emotions as these simple things,
Mm.
self-evident, to recognizing them as these intricate, multi-layered processes shaped by, well, by both our biology and our cultural inheritance.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And remember, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to discover about the world of emotions, from, the specific neural pathways involved to the ways that they influence our decisions, our relationships, even the course of history, really.
Well, you've definitely sparked my curiosity. I'm going to be looking at my own emotions and those of the people around me in a whole new light from now on. Thanks for taking me on this incredible deep dive. It's been a real pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, the journey of understanding emotions, it's a lifelong one. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep delving deeper into this fascinating world of, well, what it means to feel.